The dead man in the snow was a stranger. The ledger in his frozen hands was a weapon. Martha had endured 12 years of Silas's cruelty, his fists, his mockery, his slow, deliberate erosion of everything she was. She had survived by becoming invisible, but invisibility had its limits, and tonight, with a dead Pinkerton agent's secrets clutched to her chest and Silas's dogs howling through the blizzard behind her, invisibility was going to get her killed. She didn't expect salvation. She'd stopped believing in it years ago. She certainly didn't expect it to arrive 6'4", bleeding from 3 wounds, and angrier at her for being alive than the men trying to kill her until he saw his dead brother's handwriting, and the anger turned to ash. The trading post at Coldwater Bluff smelled like animal fat, cheap tobacco, and the particular kind of despair that soaks into wooden walls over years of quiet suffering. Martha Calloway had stopped noticing the smell somewhere around her 4th year of marriage. By the 12th, she had stopped noticing a great many things because noticing required feeling, and feeling required a kind of courage she had learned to ration carefully. She was 39 years old and built like a woman who had spent every one of those years earning her place on the earth through the sheer force of her body. Wide shoulders, thick arms that could haul a 100-pound grain sack without setting it down. Hands so calloused they barely registered cold anymore. Silas had married her for exactly those qualities, the way a man picks a draft horse over a thoroughbred when he needs something done. He had never pretended otherwise. "You're blocking the light again," Silas said from behind the counter without looking up from his ledger. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had long since stopped trying to wound and had settled instead for a steady, efficient erosion. "Move your mass somewhere useful or get out of my sight." Martha moved. She always moved. She carried 2 barrels of salted beaver pelt to the back storeroom, set them down without a sound, and stood in the dark for a moment with her eyes closed. 12 years. She had been counting lately, which was new. Counting meant she was calculating something, and calculating meant she had not entirely surrendered. That small, stubborn arithmetic was the last thing in her chest that still belonged to her. She had started watching him 3 months ago. It had begun almost by accident. She had risen before dawn to break the ice on the water trough and noticed a light moving across the far tree line, deliberate and low, the way a lantern moves when the man carrying it does not want to be seen. She had thought nothing of it that first night. The second night she paid closer attention. By the third, she had begun keeping a small record in the margins of an old almanac she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen, writing in the cramped, careful hand of a woman who had taught herself to read from a Bible and a seed catalog. Silas left every Thursday night near midnight. He returned before the post opened on Friday morning. He was always quieter on Fridays, in the way that men are quiet when they have completed something that requires quiet to complete. She did not know yet what he was doing, but she understood with the deep practical intelligence of a woman who had survived 12 years by reading the room correctly that whatever it was the lever she had been looking for, the thing that would finally give her a way out that did not end with her face down in a ditch somewhere on the Montana frontier. The blizzard came on a Thursday. It descended in the late afternoon with the kind of speed that the old trappers called a widowmaker, the sky going from gray to white to nothing in under an hour. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped past any reasonable measure, and the wind was screaming through the gaps in the post's timber walls with a sound like grief made physical. Martha had banked the fire high and told herself Silas would stay in. No man with any sense rode out into a storm like this. But Silas was not the kind of man who let weather make his decisions. She heard him moving at 11:30, the deliberate, careful sounds of a man dressing for cold. The particular sequence of sounds she had memorized over 3 months of watching. She gave him 10 minutes, then wrapped herself in her heaviest coat, pulled her wool scarf up over her face, and slipped out through the kitchen door. The cold hit her like a wall. It was the kind of cold that doesn't gradually worsen, but arrives all at once, pressing itself against every exposed inch of skin with something that feels almost personal. Martha lowered her head and moved along the back of the building, keeping close to the wall where the wind broke slightly, watching the swinging lantern light ahead of her as Silas moved toward the far side of the property where the timber grew thick and the ground sloped downward toward the frozen creek. There were other men already there. 4 of them, maybe 5. It was difficult to count through the driving snow. They were working in the way men work when they are cold and frightened and want to finish quickly. Quickly, with short, urgent movements, no conversation. 2 of them were digging. The ground was frozen solid and the work was brutal, but they were getting it done with the mechanical determination of men who had been told there would be consequences for slowness. They were burying something. Martha crouched behind a stand of spruce and watched her breath held the cold so severe it felt like her lungs were being pressed in a vise. Whatever they were lowering into that hole was large enough to require 3 men to manage. Wrapped in canvas. Heavy. The wrong shape to be a crate or a chest. Her stomach understood before her mind did. Silas stood apart from the work holding the lantern, watching with the patient expression of a man supervising an inventory task. He said something she could not hear over the wind. One of his men laughed a short, ugly sound, and then they were filling the hole back in, packing the frozen earth down with the backs of their shovels, working quickly to let the snowfall cover the rest. They were back inside in 20 minutes. Martha stayed where she was for another 10, crouched in the spruce with the blizzard trying to bury her alongside whatever they had put in the ground. She was shaking and not entirely from the cold. Then she straightened, pulled her coat tighter, and walked to the disturbed earth. She dug with her bare hands because she had not thought to bring a tool, and going back for one was not something she was willing to do. The frozen ground tore at her palms and broke 2 of her fingernails back to the quick, but she did not stop. She dug with the focused mechanical intensity of a woman who has decided that the alternative to finding out is worse than anything she might find. She hit canvas after 8 inches. She pulled it back and looked at what Silas had buried in the snow on a Thursday night in the middle of a blizzard, and she did not scream, though something in her chest rose toward it. The man had been dead for some hours already, his face still and blue-white under the lantern light she had brought with her, his expression not peaceful exactly, but finished the way faces go when the body's argument with the world is over. He was dressed in trail clothes, well-made, not cheap, the coat of a man who traveled professionally through difficult country. It was the badge she almost missed. She found it sewn into the lining of his coat, a small oval of silver-plated brass, its face engraved with the words she had to hold the lantern close to read. Pinkerton National Detective Agency. She stared at it for a long moment while the blizzard moved around her, and the dead man held his silence with the absolute patience of the dead. Then she found the ledger. It was tucked inside his shirt, held against his body by a length of cord looped around his neck, as if he had carried it that way, deliberately understanding that it was the thing most worth protecting. Leather-bound, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, its pages dense with a tiny, precise handwriting that arranged itself into symbols and substitutions she recognized immediately as cipher. She had seen cipher once before in a Harper's Weekly article about the war, the way armies kept their communication secret, and the sight of it now in a dead man's hands, in a hole in the frozen ground on her husband's property, told her with absolute clarity what she was looking at. This was evidence. This was the kind of evidence that destroyed men. She did not think beyond that. Thinking beyond that would have paralyzed her, and paralysis was a luxury she could not afford. She tucked the ledger inside her own coat against her own chest, in unconscious imitation of the dead man's instinct, and she covered him back over as carefully as she could, not out of sentiment, but because if Silas discovered the grave disturbed before she was clear of his reach, she would not make it to morning. She was back in the kitchen in 15 minutes. She moved through the dark post with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned to be invisible in her own home, pulling her traveling clothes from the chest at the foot of the bed where Silas slept with his back to the wall and his pistol on the nightstand. She did not take much. A change of clothes, the almanac with its 3 months of careful margins, the small amount of cash money she had skimmed in coins over the course of 2 years from the till, never enough in any single week to notice totaling now something just over $40. The ledger. The dead man's badge, which she did not entirely know why she took, but took anyway. She looked at her husband sleeping and felt something she had expected to feel and did not. No grief, no residual tenderness, not even the hot satisfaction of finally leaving. Only a clear, cold assessment of the distance between herself and the door and whether she could cover it without waking him. She could. The blizzard received her without ceremony. She walked north because north was away from town and away from the post road where Silas's men would look first, and because there was a settlement called Ridgecross she had heard mentioned by travelers that was supposedly 3 days on foot through the high country, which was 3 days too far to survive in this cold without luck or help, or both. She knew that and walked anyway, because the alternative was behind her, and the alternative was worse. She had been walking for 2 hours when she heard the dogs. She heard them before she saw them. The hounds came through the blizzard as sound first, a baying that cut through the wind with the particular urgency of animals that have found a scent and committed to it entirely. Martha did not stop walking when she heard them. She walked faster, which was not the same as running, but was everything her body had left to give after 2 hours in the killing cold. The terrain had been rising steadily since she left the post road, the forest thickening around her into the kind of old growth that swallowed light and direction both. She had been navigating by feel and by the slope of the ground beneath her boots, keeping the rise to her left moving parallel to what she believed was the ridgeline. She was not lost exactly, but she was not found either, and in a blizzard at 30 below, that distinction did not matter much. The dogs were getting louder. She counted them by ear, the way she had learned to count Silas's moods by pitch and pattern. 3 hounds, maybe 4, which meant at least 2 riders behind them because Silas did not trust any man alone with his tracking dogs. He valued those animals more than he valued most people, which said everything that needed saying about Silas Calloway as a human being. Martha crested a small rise and stopped. The ground ahead of her dropped away into a ravine, steep-sided and black in the storm, the bottom invisible under the blown snow. She could hear water somewhere down in it, moving fast enough to stay unfrozen, which meant the ice at the edges would be unreliable, and the crossing, if there was one, would be a thing to attempt in daylight with a rope and a prayer, not in the dark in the middle of a blizzard with dogs 40 seconds behind her. She turned left. The ravine curved with her. She turned right. It curved that direction too, the land bending in the way it does when it has decided to stop cooperating entirely. She stood at the edge and looked down into the darkness, and understood with a flat factual clarity that she had run as far as the land was going to let her run. The first dog came through the tree line 30 yards behind her. It was a big blue tick, heavy-shouldered, and it pulled up short when it saw her, not because it was uncertain, but because it was waiting for the men behind it to catch up the way trained animals wait when the work has been done and the rest is not their job. The second dog appeared to its left. Then the third, smaller, a cur mix, still baying. Then the men. 2 riders came through the trees with lanterns raised, and Martha recognized the one on the left as Cole Reardon Silas's foreman. A lean, weathered man with a mustache that made him look like a villain from a dime novel and the moral architecture to match. He pulled his horse up and looked at her across the distance with an expression that was not angry and not amused, but simply professional, the look of a man who has finished a job. "Mrs. Calloway," he said loud enough to carry over the wind. "You look cold." "I am cold," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Mr. Calloway wants his property back." He was not looking at her coat when he said it, but she felt the ledger against her chest like a brand. All of it. She did not answer. There was no answer worth giving. She looked at the ravine behind her and looked at Cole Reardon and made the kind of calculation that a woman makes when both options are the same option dressed in different clothes. The second rider had his rifle out now, not raised, just resting across his saddle, with the casual authority of a man who does not need to aim yet because the conversation has not ended yet. What ended the conversation was not Martha. It came from the trees to the east fast, and without warning, the way violence arrives when it is delivered by someone who knows what they are doing. The first rider's horse screamed and reared, throwing the man with the rifle sideways into the snow before he had time to react. Cole Reardon spun his own horse and got his hand to his pistol, and then something hit him from the left, with enough force to knock him clean out of the saddle, and he went down hard and did not get up. The dogs scattered. Martha stood at the edge of the ravine and watched a man walk out of the blizzard. He was enormous. That was the first thing, the thing her mind registered before any other detail, the sheer physical scale of him, well over 6 feet, and built in a way that suggested the size was not decorative, but structural, the kind of mass that develops over decades of genuine physical work in genuine physical country. He wore a heavy buffalo coat that made him look wider than he was, which was already considerable. His face, what she could see of it above his beard and below the brim of his hat, was heavily scarred along the left jaw and cheekbone. The skin there pulled tight in the particular way of old burn damage. He was dragging Cole Reardon by the collar with one hand. He dropped him in the snow like a man setting down something he found mildly inconvenient, then looked at the second rider, who had recovered enough to be sitting up and reaching again for his rifle. The large man looked at him for a moment without changing his expression. "Leave it," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried and contained exactly the quantity of threat required to make further argument seem unproductive. The rider left it. "Get on your horse," the man said. "Take him." He indicated Cole Reardon with a slight movement of his boot. "Tell whoever sent you that this terrain kills people who don't know it. Tell them I know it." The rider pulled Cole Reardon up across his saddle with visible difficulty, then turned both horses back toward the tree line without a word. The dogs had long since disappeared into the storm. Martha watched them go and then looked at the man standing in the snow 10 feet from her and tried to think of something adequate to say, and found she had nothing. He turned and looked at her for the first time with any real attention. His eyes were pale gray or light blue. It was hard to tell in the storm, and they moved over her with the flat assessing quality of a man who has spent a long time reading landscapes for danger. "You're not dressed for this," he said. "I know that. How long have you been out? 2 hours, maybe a little more." He made a sound that was not quite a word and turned back toward the trees without further discussion. He walked 8 steps and stopped and looked back at her, not with warmth exactly, but with the grudging acknowledgement of a man who has accepted an inconvenient fact. "Well," he said, "come on then." She followed him. His name was Elias. He did not offer the last name, and she did not ask for it. Understanding instinctively that she was being extended a narrow and conditional hospitality that would not survive unnecessary questions. He moved through the forest with the complete assurance of a man navigating his own home, which she supposed this was the whole of the high country, being his parlor and his kitchen and his front yard alike. She followed his lantern through a half-mile of dense timber, and then up a switchback trail she would never have found alone, and then through a stand of massive ponderosa pine to a cabin set back against the rock face of the ridge itself, low and heavily built, its roof loaded with 2 feet of snow, and its single window showing the amber light of a banked fire. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical blow. Her legs went uncertain beneath her, and she put a hand against the doorframe and stood there for a moment while her body tried to remember what temperature felt like without crisis attached to it. "Sit," Elias said, moving to the fire without looking at her. She sat on the bench nearest the hearth and felt the heat begin to work at her hands and face, with a sensation that was just short of pain, the blood coming back into the extremities with the reluctant, prickling insistence of something that had almost given up and was being persuaded to try again. He brought her coffee. Not asked, just brought it, setting the tin cup on the bench beside her with the brevity of a man who has decided that the bare minimum of hospitality is still hospitality. She wrapped both hands around it and drank and said nothing. He sat across the fire from her and looked into it with the expression of a man who has been alone long enough that another person in the room is an active and effortful thing to manage. The cabin told her things about him the way spaces always tell you things about the people who have shaped them. It was meticulous in a way that went beyond cleanliness into something closer to discipline. Every tool in its place, every surface cleared, the kind of order that a person imposes on their immediate surroundings when the interior landscape has become too difficult to organize. There were no photographs, no decorative objects, nothing on the walls except a single iron hook that held a rifle, and beside it, inexplicably, a small worn leather glove. A child's glove hanging there the way people hang things they cannot put away and cannot look at. Martha looked away from it. "You'll leave at first light," Elias said. It was not a question, and it was not unkind. It was simply the terms he was offering. "All right," she said. He nodded and looked back at the fire, and the arrangement seemed to satisfy him. The matter settled her presence temporary and therefore manageable. She began to work at her coat buttons with fingers that were still clumsy from the cold, pulling the coat open to let the warmth reach her properly, and the ledger shifted inside her shirt and slid partially free of its binding and dropped. It hit the floor between them with a sound that was small and completely ordinary. Elias looked down at it. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is not certain he is actually seeing, with a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. Then he leaned forward and picked it up and turned it over in his hands and opened the front cover, and Martha watched his face in the firelight and saw something move through it that she could not name precisely, but recognized in the way you recognize weather before it arrived. He was looking at the handwriting on the inside cover. Just a few lines, a name, and a notation, the kind of identifying mark a careful man puts in his belongings. She could not read it from where she sat. She did not need to. The information was already written in the lines around Elias's mouth, and the sudden absolute rigidity of his shoulders, and the way his breath changed, becoming shallow and careful, the breath of a man trying to hold something inside that is pressing very hard to get out. "Where did you get this?" he said. Not a question either. The flattest possible arrangement of words around the most important thing he had asked in a very long time. "I dug it up," Martha said quietly, "on my husband's property. There was a man buried in the snow." She paused. He had a Pinkerton badge sewn into his coat. Elias closed his eyes. The fire popped and settled. The blizzard pressed against the cabin walls with its low, constant voice. Martha sat very still and watched a man she had known for less than an hour receive news that was rearranging something fundamental inside him, and she understood without being told that the man in the snow was not a stranger to him and that first light was no longer the arrangement either of them was operating under. "His name," Elias said. His voice had changed. It had gone to a register below expression, the place voices go when expression is no longer adequate. The man they buried. Martha shook her head slowly. "I don't know his name. I only found the badge and the ledger. But the ledger is in cipher, and I haven't been able to read it." Elias opened the cover again and looked at the handwriting, and this time she could see clearly what it cost him to look at it, the muscles in his jaw working, his eyes going bright in a way that had nothing to do with the firelight. "Thomas," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. His name was Thomas. He said it the way people say the names of the dead when they are saying them for the first time out loud, testing whether the world will confirm it, whether saying it makes it more real or less. The fire gave no answer. The blizzard gave no answer. Martha gave none either, because there was no answer to give, only the silence of someone willing to sit inside another person's grief without trying to diminish it with words. Elias set the ledger down on his knee and looked at it, and then looked at the wall above the fire where the child's glove hung on its iron hook, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the story he has been telling himself for 20 years is not the only story there is, and that the correction has arrived too late and cost too much and come from entirely the wrong direction. "He was looking for me," Elias said, not to her, mostly to himself and to Thomas and to the fire and to whatever accounting the dead keep with the living. "He spent 10 years looking for me, and I led him straight to the man who killed my family." Martha said nothing. She picked up her coffee cup and held it and waited, because she understood now with absolute certainty that she was not leaving at first light, and neither the storm outside nor the man across the fire had any further say in that matter. The blizzard did not relent for 3 days. It was the kind of storm that the mountain country produces once or twice a decade, the kind that rewrites the landscape entirely, filling in ravines and burying trail markers and turning familiar terrain into something that has to be learned again from the beginning when it finally passes. Elias seemed unsurprised by it. He moved through the cabin with the measured economy of a man who has weathered many such storms alone and has long since made his peace with the particular quality of silence they impose. Martha was not accustomed to silence that wasn't hostile. In 12 years at the trading post, quiet had always meant Silas was building towards something, the stillness before the contempt arrived, the pause before the next carefully delivered diminishment. She spent the first day in the cabin, waiting for the silence to turn on her, and gradually, incrementally understanding that it was not going to. On the morning of the second day, Elias set Thomas's ledger on the table between them without preamble, and sat down across from her and said, "Can you work a cipher?" "I know the principle of it," Martha said. "I've never done it." He nodded as if that was sufficient. "Thomas used a substitution system. He taught it to me when we were boys." He said this with the careful flatness of a man handling something fragile by keeping his voice very steady. "I can read it, but there is a great deal of it, and my eyes are not what they were for close work." She understood what he was asking. "Tell me the key, and I'll read it aloud." He told her the key. It was elegant in its simplicity, a shifted alphabet with a numerical modifier on every 7th symbol, the kind of system a clever boy invents and never entirely outgrows. Martha applied it slowly at first, sounding the substitutions under her breath, and then with increasing speed as the patterns settled into her hands, the way patterns do when the mind has accepted them. Elias sat across the table and listened, and occasionally stopped her to write something down in his own cramped hand on a piece of brown paper he had cut from a supply wrapper. Thomas had been thorough. That was the first thing the ledger established beyond any doubt. He had been tracking Silas Calloway's operation for the better part of 2 years, building a case with the patient methodical precision of a man who understood that evidence assembled in haste falls apart in court. The ledger documented weapon shipments, dates and quantities, and destinations, transactions conducted through the trading post's legitimate fur business as a cover payments received in gold from border raiders who used the weapons to terrorize homesteaders across 3 territories. Names, amounts, routes, all of it recorded in Thomas's tiny, precise hand, with the thoroughness of a man who knew that the paper would outlast him if the work required it to. It required it to. Martha read for 6 hours the first day, stopping only when the light through the cabin's single window became insufficient, and Elias brought the oil lamp to the table without being asked. She drank the coffee he set beside her without commenting on it. He refilled it without being asked either. They developed a working rhythm as the afternoon wore toward evening, the kind of unspoken coordination that forms between people engaged in a shared task. Martha reading Elias, recording both of them building the architecture of Silas's guilt word by careful word. She was halfway through the ledger's final section when she read the date. She read it twice before she said anything, checking the cipher against the key to be certain she had it right, because the date she was reading was 20 years old, and she could not immediately understand why Thomas would begin a section of current operational intelligence with an entry from 2 decades prior. Then she read the next line and understood that this was not operational intelligence. This was something else entirely. Elias, she said. Something in her voice made him look up immediately. There's a section here that's different from the rest, she said carefully. It's dated 20 years back. Thomas writes that he found this information in the records of a man named Gareth Hollis, who was one of Silas's early partners. Hollis died 4 years ago and left his papers to a church archive in Billings, and Thomas found them when he was building the weapons case. She stopped. "Read it," Elias said. His voice had returned to that register below expression. She read it. Thomas had found the original account in Hollis's own hand, a record kept with the compulsive specificity of a guilty man who cannot stop describing what he did, the kind of confession that is written not for absolution, but simply because the weight of it requires somewhere to be set down. Hollis had been with Silas in the winter of 1863, when Silas had been hired to guide a family through the high pass before the heavy snows closed it. A man and his wife and their young child headed west. The man had been carrying gold, a substantial amount, sewn into the lining of a leather traveling case, and Silas had seen it when the case came open during the first night's camp. Martha read the rest of it in a voice she kept as level as she could manage, because the words themselves were doing enough damage without her adding to it with her tone. Silas had waited until the 3rd night, when they were deepest into the high country and furthest from any help. He had poured water into the wheel bearings of the wagon while the family slept, ensuring they would seize in the cold. He had redistributed their food and supply weight under cover of darkness, hiding enough of it in his own pack to guarantee that when the wagon failed and the family was forced to continue on foot, they would not have sufficient provisions to make it through. He had then manufactured a reason to ride ahead, promising to bring help from the next settlement, and he had ridden away and never looked back. He had taken the gold with him. Hollis had been there for all of it. Hollis had helped with the supplies. Hollis had watched Silas ride away and had ridden with him, and had spent the next 4 decades telling himself that the family might have found another way through, that someone else might have come along the pass, that the cold might not have been as severe as that particular winter's cold was known to be. No one else had come along the pass. The family had not found another way through. Martha stopped reading. The cabin was absolutely silent, except for the blizzard against the walls and the fire in the hearth and the sound of Elias breathing, which had changed in a way she recognized with her whole body, the breathing of a person who is receiving information that is structurally altering something inside them, the way a building sounds when one of its load-bearing elements begins to give way. She looked up from the ledger. Elias was not looking at her. He was looking at the table in front of him, with an expression she did not have a word for. Not grief. Exactly. Not rage. Something that contained both of those things and several others, besides something that was happening at a level below what expressions are normally built to convey. His hands were flat on the table. She could see that he was pressing them down, using the pressure to hold himself in his chair, in his body, in the present moment, against something that was pulling very hard in another direction. "Your family," Martha said quietly. Not a question. He did not answer for a long time. The fire settled. The blizzard pressed. Outside the cabin, the mountain held its enormous, indifferent silence. "I was supposed to be with them," he said finally. His voice had gone very quiet and very careful, The way voices go when the speaker is managing something at the absolute limit of what can be managed. I had gone ahead to arrange the rooms in Ridgecross. We had agreed I would go ahead, and they would follow with Silas as their guide, because Silas had been recommended to us by 3 men whose judgment I trusted. He stopped, started again. When they didn't arrive, I went back up the pass. I found the wagon. I found them. He stopped again, and this time the stopping was final, the period at the end of a sentence that no one needs to hear completed. Martha sat with that. She had expected when the revelation came that he would rage. A man of his size and his obvious capacity for physical violence, receiving the information that the death of his family had not been a tragic accident born of his own poor judgment, but a deliberate act of murder for profit committed by a man he had subsequently spent 20 years living within a day's ride of. She had braced herself for it. She had been wrong too. What happened instead was that Elias Voss came apart very quietly. It began in his hands the pressing down against the table, becoming something else, the fingers curling, the knuckles going white. And then a sound came out of him that was not a word, and not quite a cry, but something between the two, low and involuntary, the sound a person makes when something that has been held under pressure for a very long time is suddenly released. He pushed back from the table and stood there, unable to go anywhere, and Martha watched his breathing come apart, watched it become ragged and too fast and too shallow, watched his chest work against it with the desperate mechanical effort of a man who is drowning in open air. He went down onto one knee, then the other. Then he was on the cabin floor with his forehead pressed against the rough wood planking and his shoulders shaking with the violence of something that had been waiting 20 years for permission to exist. Martha understood what she was watching. She had had her own version of it, smaller and quieter, alone in the kitchen at the trading post on the night of her 4th anniversary, when she had finally understood with absolute certainty that no one was coming, that no circumstance was going to change on its own, that the life she was living was the life she was going to live until it killed her. The collapse that comes not from new pain, but from the removal of the story you have been using to make the old pain bearable. For 20 years, Elias had carried his guilt like a structural element. The belief that his poor judgment had cost his family their lives had been terrible, had been the thing that drove him into isolation and exile and self-imposed penance. But it had also been his. It had given his suffering a shape and a reason and a direction. He had been punishing himself for a decision he made. That was a story a person could survive inside, barely at great cost, but survive. What Martha had just read him was a different story entirely. He had not made a fatal error in judgment. He had trusted a man who had decided to murder his family for gold. He had been a victim so completely that his grief itself had been a lie built on a false premise, pointed at the wrong target for 2 decades. The guilt that had been his identity, his cross, the organizing principle of his entire interior life, had been manufactured by the man who killed his wife and child. He was not guilty, he was only destroyed. Martha sat at the table for a moment and looked at him on the floor and felt something move through her that was not pity, because pity was a thing you felt looking down at someone, and she did not feel down. She felt a cross. She knew what it was to have the story that holds you together taken away. She knew what it was to be left without the narrative that makes the suffering make sense. She knew the particular terror of the floor coming up to meet you when the structure gives way. She stood up. She crossed the cabin floor and stood over him and looked down at the shaking of his shoulders and the way his hands were pressed flat against the wood, and she felt something harden in her chest with a quality that was not coldness, but its opposite, a heat that had direction and purpose, and no patience left for the luxury of watching someone she had come to respect dissolve into the floor of a cabin while Silas Calloway was still alive and warm somewhere below the mountain. She did not deliberate. She reached down and she slapped him across the back of the head with the flat of her calloused palm, hard enough to be unmistakable. He went still. She slapped him again, this time on the shoulder, and said, "Get up." Martha. Her name in his mouth for the first time, ragged and broken. "Get up," she said again, and her voice carried the full weight of 12 years of being told she was too slow, too heavy, too broken to matter, and finding out every single time that she was not, that she was still there, that she was still standing. "You are going to let your weakness insult their memory again. Get off this floor." The word again landed exactly where she intended it to. She watched it reach him, watched the shaking in his shoulders change quality, the grief converting under pressure into something with more structure to it, something that could hold weight. He raised his head from the floor. His face was wrecked and wet and furious, and the fury was the part she had been waiting for, the part that meant he was coming back from wherever he had gone. "There is a man at the bottom of this mountain," Martha said, her voice level and clear, and carrying no more and no less than what was needed, "who murdered your wife and your child and your brother and 12 years of my life, and he is warm and fed and asleep, and he believes we are too cold and too broken and too insignificant to do anything about it." Elias got to his feet. It was not graceful, and it was not fast, but it was absolute, the rising of a man who has made a decision at a level below argument. He stood at his full height and looked at her, and the pale eyes were dry now and very clear and contained something she had not seen in them before, a cold and focused quality that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with what comes after grief, when grief has finally finished its work. "How much of the ledger is left?" he said. "A third," Martha said, "maybe a little more." He pulled his chair back to the table and sat down. "Then read," he said. She sat. She found her place. She read. Outside, the blizzard raged on against the cabin walls with everything it had, and inside, two people who had both been broken by the same man sat across a table from each other and built page by careful page the instrument of his destruction. The blizzard broke on the 4th morning. Martha stood at the cabin door and watched the sky clear from the west, with the sudden theatrical quality that mountain weather has, the clouds pulling back like a curtain drawn by a decisive hand, leaving behind a world so white and so absolute in its silence that it hurt to look at directly. The cold that followed the clearing was worse than the cold of the storm, the dry, killing cold that arrives when the wind drops and the temperature falls without anything to slow it. The thermometer outside the cabin door reading 30 below and dropping. Elias was already at the window. He had not slept in a way that looked like sleeping. He had sat in his chair by the fire and gone somewhere internal and quiet. His eyes sometimes closed and sometimes not, his breathing slow and deliberate, in the way of a man who is using the hours of darkness to complete an interior process that cannot be rushed. By the time the sky cleared, he was standing at the window with his rifle in his hands and the look on his face of a man who has finished grieving and begun planning, which in Elias Voss's case produced an expression of such focused and absolute calm that it was in its own way more frightening than rage would have been. "They'll come today," he said. Martha did not ask how he knew. She had understood by the 2nd day in the cabin that his knowledge of this mountain and everything on it operated at a level below articulation, the deep instinctive reading of terrain and weather and human behavior that develops in a man who has spent 20 years alone in a landscape that kills the inattentive. She trusted it the way she had learned to trust her own reading of Silas's moods, not because she could always explain the logic, but because the logic had been proven right too many times to question. "How many?" she said. "Silas won't come himself until the end." He said this with the certainty of a man who has assessed his opponent accurately. He'll send the posse first, wear down the position. He'll want to watch from safety until it's settled and then arrive to collect. He paused. "Cole Reardon will be with the first group. He won't have forgiven the ravine." How many in the first group? 6, maybe 8. He can't spare more than that from the post without leaving it undefended. And Silas doesn't leave things undefended. He turned from the window and looked at her with those pale, clear eyes. "Can you shoot?" "I can shoot," Martha said. "I'm not fast and I'm not accurate past 50 yards, but I can shoot." He nodded as if this was satisfactory and moved to the back of the cabin where his stores were arranged with the same meticulous order as everything else in his life. He had been preparing since the previous afternoon, moving through the cabin and the outbuildings with a quiet efficiency that Martha had watched carefully because she understood she was watching expertise, the preparation of a man who has spent 20 years ensuring that his position is defensible, because defensible positions are how solitary men in hostile country stay alive. He had spiked the trail approaches. She had helped him with that, carrying the materials he needed with the brute, reliable strength that had always been her most honest asset, holding things in place while he rigged them, understanding the design without needing it explained, because the design was logical, and her mind was a logical one when it was given something worth applying itself to. The main trail up to the cabin was now a sequence of unpleasant surprises, spaced at intervals calculated to disrupt and separate a group moving in column. The eastern approach, the one that looked easier on the terrain but wasn't, was worse. He had positioned 2 barrels of supplies in the outbuilding adjacent to the cabin, accessible from the cabin's back door through a covered passage he had built years ago for exactly the kind of winter emergency that required moving between structures without exposure. He showed her the passage and showed her the outbuilding and showed her what was in it, the lamp oil and the pitch, and the 2 large barrels of black powder he kept for mining work on the claim he had never quite gotten around to abandoning. And he explained to her what he had in mind for those barrels with the same flat, practical tone he used for everything, and she had looked at the barrels and looked at him and said, "All right." They did not have long to wait. The first sound came before noon, the distant crack of a branch giving way under a boot that had misread the snow cover. The particular sound of someone on the main trail who did not know the main trail. Elias was at the rifle port he had cut in the cabin's front wall before Martha had arrived, a narrow slot that gave a field of fire down the approach while presenting almost no target from below. He settled into position with the unhurried precision of a man who has done this before, in other circumstances and other winters, and simply waited. Martha took the second position, the cabin's single window standing to the side of it, with her back against the wall, so that the glass was in front of her, and not behind, the way Elias had shown her, with the spare rifle he had given her held at the level of her waist, and her breathing kept deliberately slow. Cole Reardon's voice came up the trail before his men did. Voss. He had a carrying voice, flat and functional, a man comfortable with command at distance. "We're not here for you. Send out the woman and the book and we ride back down." Elias did not respond. He had told her he would not respond, and she had understood why without needing it explained. Response was engagement, and engagement was on their terms. And their terms were the only terms Cole Reardon understood how to work with. Highlands was a different vocabulary entirely. The first of Silas's men came into the approach clearing through the trees and stepped directly into the first of Elias's preparations, a concealed deadfall of logs triggered by a tripline, and went down hard under 200 pounds of timber, with a sound that removed him comprehensively from the subsequent proceedings. The man behind him pulled up short, and in doing so placed himself precisely where Elias had calculated someone pulling up short would place himself, and Elias shot him with the clean economy of a man who has made his peace with the necessity of violence and wastes nothing in the execution of it. The clearing erupted. Silas's men were not cowards, and they were not fools. They were experienced riders who had operated on the frontier long enough to know what a prepared position looked like, and what they did was what experienced men do when they understand they have walked into one, which was to break formation and seek cover and stop moving in the direction the trap expected them to move. 3 of them pushed left into the tree line, which was where Elias wanted them to push, because the tree line on the left fed directly into the eastern approach, which was worse than the main trail. Martha heard them hit the eastern approach from the second position and kept her breathing slow. Cole Reardon himself came straight up the middle with 2 men flanking him, which was either courage or vanity, and possibly both. He moved with the low, efficient crouch of a man who has been shot at enough times to have learned the body's proper relationship to incoming fire, and he made it to the cabin's exterior wall before Elias could get another shot, and pressed himself against the logs with his back to the wall and his pistol drawn. From inside, they could hear him breathing. "Smart man," Reardon said conversationally to the wall. "Smart position. You've been sitting up here 20 years building this." A pause. "But there's 7 of us and 2 of you, and we can wait longer than you can." Elias looked at Martha across the cabin interior. She looked back at him. He tilted his head slightly toward the back passage, and she understood immediately the way she had learned to understand his communications over the 4 days in the cabin. The tilt meaning go, meaning now, meaning I will manage this side. She went. The covered passage was low and dark and bitterly cold, but it was 30 feet, and she covered it quickly, emerging into the outbuilding with the sound of the engagement at the front of the cabin reaching her as a muffled sequence of shots and movement, and Reardon's voice still talking to the wall with the confident persistence of a man who believes he holds the dominant position. She moved through the outbuilding to the barrels and assessed the situation with the quick practical intelligence that had been keeping her alive since she walked out of the trading post 4 nights ago. The outbuilding's rear door opened onto the back of the cabin's position, looking down the slope toward the tree line where Silas's men had retreated. She could see 2 of them from the door working their way up through the snow with the careful lateral movement of men trying to flank, and she understood that they were attempting to complete the encirclement that Reardon's frontal pressure was designed to set up. She went back to the barrels. They were heavy. The first one, the lamp oil, was 110 pounds full, and she moved it with both arms wrapped around it and her back taking the load and her legs driving the way she had moved 10,000 barrels and sacks and crates in 12 years at the trading post. The way her body had been shaped by forced labor into something that Silas had intended as degradation and had instead produced as instrument. She got it to the rear door and tipped it onto its side and rolled it out onto the slope, giving it a direction with the flat of her boot, watching it find the fall line in the snow and begin to move. It rolled with gathering momentum down the slope, directly into the path of the 2 flanking men, striking the first and catching the second across the knees, and coming to rest in the small depression between them, spilling oil across the snow in a dark spreading fan. She was already back at the outbuilding before they had finished processing what had happened. The second barrel was heavier. The black powder was packed dense, and the barrel was old, its wood dark with age and handling, and it weighed enough that she felt the effort in places she did not usually feel effort. She stood with it in her arms for a moment and breathed, and then she moved, because breathing was a luxury, and moving was a requirement, and she got it to the door, and she rolled it down the slope after the first one with everything her arms and her back and her 20 years of being underestimated had to give. It struck the oil barrel with a resonant wooden crack and came to rest against it. She stepped back from the door and pressed herself against the outbuilding wall and drew breath into her lungs and yelled with every ounce of volume she possessed, "Elias, the slope!" She heard glass break at the cabin window. The shot came a half-second later, a single crack from Elias's rifle, with the quality of a man who shoots once because once is what the situation requires, and then the world outside the outbuilding door became a different kind of world entirely. The explosion was not the loud theatrical thing of dime novels. It was a concussive pressure that she felt in her chest and her back teeth and the palms of her hands, simultaneously followed by a wave of heat that reached her through the outbuilding wall like an open oven door swung wide. The sound caught up with the pressure a fraction of a second later, a deep percussive boom that rolled up the mountain and came back off the ridge as an echo that sounded almost like the mountain's own commentary on the proceedings. Then the snow moved. She heard it before she understood what she was hearing. A sound like the mountain clearing its throat low and building the particular grinding roar of a large mass of consolidated snow deciding in one collective instant to go somewhere else. The localized avalanche that Elias had told her was possible had told her he had calculated as possible when he positioned the barrels the slope above the engagement point, being loaded with 4 days of accumulated storm snow sitting on an ice layer that was already stressed, needing only a sufficient concussive event to resolve its internal argument about whether to stay or go. It went. Martha stayed against the outbuilding wall and listened to it go, with her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat against the logs behind her, feeling the vibration of it move through the mountain beneath her feet, listening to the sound decrease from a roar to a rumble, to a settling, the way large things sound when they have finished moving and begun being still. When she opened her eyes, the slope below the outbuilding door was a different slope than the one she had rolled the barrels down. The tree line was altered. The flanking men were not visible. The depression where the barrels had come to rest was gone, filled and covered and compressed under several feet of new white. And the fire that had followed the explosion had been extinguished by the same snow that extinguished everything else in that section of the mountain's face. She heard Elias's boots on the passage floor. He came through the outbuilding door and stood beside her and looked at the slope with the expression of a man assessing completed work, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular quality of calm that follows the conclusion of something that required everything you had, and was given everything you had, and is now done. "Reardon," she said. "Inside," Elias said. "He came through the door when the explosion hit. He's inside the cabin." A pause that contained several things. "He's not a concern anymore." Martha looked at the altered slope and the buried white, and thought about Silas Calloway, warm and cautious at the bottom of the mountain, waiting for the sound of success before he rode up to collect his victory. She thought about the ledger against her chest and the dead Pinkerton badge in her coat pocket, and Thomas in his frozen grave, and the child's glove on the iron hook, and 12 years of a life spent being told she was too heavy and too slow and too broken to matter. "He'll come now," she said, "when no one rides back down." "Yes," Elias said. He was looking at the slope with those pale, clear eyes and the cold fury that had replaced everything else in them since she had pulled him off the cabin floor. "He'll come now." Outside the cleared sky was the hard, brilliant blue of high mountain winter, the sun low and sharp throwing long shadows across the white in every direction. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are also dangerous completely and without apology. The way the mountain country had always been beautiful. The way it had been beautiful on the night 20 years ago, when Silas Calloway had ridden away from a family he had left to die in it, and never once looked back. He was going to look back now. Silas Calloway rode up the mountain alone. That was the first thing Martha noticed when she saw him emerge from the tree line below the cabin, the singular quality of his arrival. No riders flanking him, no dogs ranging ahead. He came on a black horse at a careful walk, picking his way through the altered terrain with the instinctive caution of a man who has survived a long career of dangerous things by never committing his full weight to any surface until he was certain it would hold. He was dressed well for the cold, heavy coat. Good boots, the kind of equipment a man buys when he has enough money to buy the best, and enough vanity to want it seen. He carried a rifle across his saddle and a pistol on his hip, and he rode with the particular ease of a man who believes the outcome of the situation ahead of him has already been determined. Elias watched him come from the rifle port. Martha watched from the window, standing to the side of it, with her back against the wall, and her hand steady and the spare rifle held at her waist, and her breathing kept to the slow, deliberate rhythm she had been practicing since the morning. She watched her husband ride up the mountain toward the cabin, where his posse was not waiting for him, toward the altered slope that had swallowed his men, and the fire that had finished what the snow had not. And she watched his face as the evidence of what had happened resolved itself into clarity for him, the way a man's face changes when the story he has been telling himself collides with the story the world is actually telling. He pulled his horse up 50 yards from the cabin door. He sat there for a long moment reading the terrain, reading the silence, reading the absence of the men he had sent ahead, and the absence of the outcome he had ridden up to collect. Martha watched him and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was nothing. Not fear. Not the residual bone-deep flinching that 12 years of living in proximity to his contempt had installed in her nervous system like a permanent weather condition. Not even the hot, clarifying anger that had carried her out of the trading post and through the blizzard and up the mountain. Just a clear, clean nothing, the emotional equivalent of a sky after a storm, has passed empty and very blue and full of light. Martha. His voice carried easily in the cold mountain air the flat, authoritative voice of a man accustomed to being heard. I know you're in there. Come out, and we can settle this quietly. She did not move from the wall. The ledger is evidence of nothing without a live Pinkerton agent to present it, Silas said. He had always been intelligent. That was the thing. People who had not lived with him failed to understand that his cruelty was not the cruelty of a stupid man, but the cruelty of a clever one, precise and purposeful and always aware of its own leverage. Thomas Voss was a private operative working without official sanction. His chain of custody is broken. Any territorial judge worth his salary will dismiss the whole thing before noon. A pause calculated the pause of a man who knows where the soft tissue is. Come out, Martha. You're too slow and too tired for this country, and we both know it. Elias moved. He came through the cabin door with a speed and a quietness that was startling in a man of his size, moving along the exterior wall with his rifle at his shoulder before Silas had fully processed the fact that the door had opened. Silas brought his own rifle up, and the two men held their positions across the 50 yards of white mountain air between them, each with the other clearly in his sights, each understanding exactly what the other understood about the arithmetic of the situation. Elias Voss, Silas said. He said it with recognition and with something underneath the recognition that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it, the recalibration of a man who has just discovered that a variable he had removed from his calculations 20 years ago has reappeared with compounded interest. I heard you were up here. I had hoped the mountain had taken you by now. It tried, Elias said. I was harder to kill than my family. Silas looked at him across the distance and made the assessment of a man who has survived a long career of dangerous things, and what he assessed was that Elias Voss, at 50-something, was not a man he could beat in a straight exchange at 50 yards in good light with both of them ready. The mathematics were not in his favor, and Silas had always been good at mathematics. He moved his horse left. It was a small movement, casual, the shift of a man adjusting his position for comfort, but its direction was not casual because its direction was toward the cabin wall and the cabin door and the angle that would put the cabin between himself and Elias's rifle. Martha came out of the cabin door. She came out low and fast, and with everything her body had, crossing the distance between the door and Silas's horse. In the time it takes a man to recalculate a situation that has just changed, and she reached up and got both hands on Silas's rifle arm and pulled with the full freight of her weight and her strength and 12 years of fury that had finally found its proper object. He came out of the saddle with a sound of genuine surprise, the first genuine surprise she had ever provoked in him, and they went into the snow together. He was stronger than her. He had always been stronger than her, longer-limbed and heavier through the shoulders, and he recovered from the fall faster than she expected and got his hands around her throat with the practiced efficiency of a man who has used that grip before and knows its application. The cold made her fingers slow, and she could feel the pressure building at her windpipe, and she did the only thing available to her, which was to drive her knee upward with every pound she carried behind it, and feel the grip loosen just enough, and then she was on her feet, and he was still in the snow. Elias was there. He did not shoot Silas. Martha understood afterward that he had made this decision before Silas arrived, that it was part of the cold, clear thinking of the days in the cabin, the understanding that a dead Silas in the snow on a mountain was a local event, but a living Silas in a territorial court with Thomas's ledger presented as evidence was something considerably larger and considerably more permanent. He pulled Silas up out of the snow by the back of his coat, the way he had pulled Cole Reardon up at the ravine, with the one-handed ease of a man for whom another man's weight is not a relevant variable. And he put Silas's face against the cabin wall and held him there with a forearm across the back of his neck and looked at Martha over Silas's shoulder. Martha stood in the snow and breathed. Her throat ached, and her hands were bleeding again from the cold and the struggle, and she was quite certain she had never in her life been so tired or so awake simultaneously. "There's rope in the outbuilding," she said. They tied Silas Calloway to the post of his own horse's saddle with the efficient, unsentimental thoroughness of people who have learned not to trust the security of halfway measures, and they brought him down the mountain through the brilliant cold of the cleared winter afternoon, and they delivered him to the territorial marshal's office in Ridgecross before dark. The marshal was a careful man named Aldous Webb, who had been waiting for something to break open Silas Calloway's operation for the better part of 3 years, and who received Thomas's ledger with the reverence that a man reserves for the thing he has been promised and had begun to stop believing in. He read the key sections that Martha decoded for him at his desk, while his deputy stood in the doorway, and Silas sat in the cell at the back making the sounds of a man recalculating his situation and finding the new numbers uniformly poor. "Chain of custody," Silas said from the cell in the tone of a man deploying his last reliable argument. "Private operative, no official sanction. Any judge will." Thomas Voss submitted his case file to the Chicago office 4 months ago. Marshal Webb said without looking up from the ledger. "The official investigation has been open since October." He turned a page. "You've been under federal observation for 6 months, Mr. Calloway. Thomas was working alone up here because he was trying to find his brother. The case itself has had plenty of official sanction." The sound from the cell after that was not words. They kept Elias and Martha in Ridgecross for 3 days, while Webb's deputies rode out to the trading post and the mountain and the various points the ledger identified, assembling the physical evidence that would support the documentary record Thomas had built so carefully over 2 years of patient solitary work. On the second day, a rider arrived from the territorial capital with papers that confirmed the federal jurisdiction and the reward structure that attached to it, and Webb called them into his office and set the papers on his desk and said, "The agency is prepared to offer a substantial finder's reward for the ledger and for the live capture of Calloway. The number is considerable." Martha looked at the number on the paper. She had spent 12 years skimming coins from a till a few cents at a time, building toward $40 across 2 years of careful patience. The number on Webb's paper was not $40. It was not 40 times $40. She read it twice to be certain she was reading it correctly, and then she looked at Elias sitting in the chair beside her and found him already looking at her with those pale eyes that had ceased to be cold somewhere in the course of the days in the cabin and had become instead simply clear. The eyes of a man who has had the thing obscuring his vision removed and is seeing the world at its actual distance for the first time in 20 years. He looked back at the paper. "That'll buy a considerable amount of lumber," he said. She almost laughed. It came up through her chest unexpectedly, genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh that surprises the person producing it. "It will," she said. Spring came to the high country in the way it always comes, not gently but insistently, the warmth arriving in increments that the snow resists stubbornly, before conceding the argument one hillside at a time. The melt was gradual, and then it was sudden, and the sudden part brought the river up and opened the passes and revealed in the slope below Elias's cabin, where the avalanche had resettled the terrain, the dark shape of old timber beneath the receding white. Elias found the wagon on a Tuesday morning in the first week of April. Martha was with him. She had been with him through the winter at the cabin, occupying the arrangement they had settled into, without much discussion, the two of them working the property through the coldest months, with the same unspoken coordination they had developed over Thomas's ledger. She managing the interior and the stores and the steady practical work of keeping a household alive in brutal country. He managing the exterior and the animals and the ongoing business of existing in terrain that required constant negotiation. They had not talked much about what the arrangement was or what it meant. They were both by long habit people who let things be what they were without requiring them to be named before they were ready to be named. He stood at the edge of the revealed wreckage and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The wagon had been there for 20 years, and the mountain had been at it for 20 years, and what remained was not much timber. Gone gray and silver, ironwork rusted to the color of old blood, the whole structure collapsed and partially buried, and freed now only by the departure of the snow that had hidden it. But it was there. It had been there all along beneath the surface of the thing he had been living on, patient as the mountain itself. Martha stood beside him and said nothing. There was a spot above the cabin on the south-facing slope where the ground was soft and the pines were old, and the view down the valley was the kind of view that makes a person understand why people come to difficult country and stay. Elias chose it without much deliberation, as if he had known for a long time where it would be when the time came. They dug the graves together over 3 days, working with a shared and respectful silence that felt different from the silence of the cabin in the early days, warmer and more inhabited, the silence of people who have chosen to be in the same place rather than merely finding themselves there. He had no names for the markers except the names he carried in his memory and transferred now to the wood with a chisel and a steady hand. His wife, Clara, his daughter May, who had been 4 years old and had not yet lost the habit of reaching for his hand when she was uncertain about the footing. His brother Thomas, who had spent 10 years looking for a man who had been 100 miles away the whole time, and who had found him finally in the most Thomas-like way possible, which was by following the evidence wherever it led, regardless of the personal cost. Elias stood at the 3 graves when the markers were set, and the ground was settled, and the late afternoon light was coming across the valley in long gold bars that made the new grass at the edge of the tree line look almost luminous. And he stood there for a long time in the way that a man stands when he is finishing a conversation that has been interrupted for 20 years. Martha stood a distance behind him, close enough to be present, and far enough to give the conversation the privacy it deserved. When he turned around, his face was not the wrecked, undone face of the man she had watched come apart on the cabin floor in the firelight. It was something else, something she did not have a precise word for, but recognized the same way she had recognized the laugh that surprised her in Webb's office, as something genuine and unguarded that had been waiting a long time for the conditions that would allow it to exist. He looked like a man who has set down something very heavy after a very long time of carrying it, and is discovering with some surprise that his hands still work. "Clara would have liked you," he said. He said it simply without decoration. Martha considered this. "I would have liked her," she said. "Any woman who chose you had good judgment." He made a sound that was almost the laugh she had never quite heard from him, almost but not entirely, and he walked toward her across the new grass of the spring hillside with the unhurried step of a man who has somewhere to be and is no longer in a hurry to arrive. And they walked back to the cabin together in the long mountain evening without needing to say much more than that. The way station took most of the summer to build. It was Elias's idea in the way that things are a person's idea when they have been ready for the idea for a long time and simply needed the conditions to make it possible. He had spent 20 years in isolation that had been intended as penance and had become habit and had been revealed by Martha's presence as loneliness plain and uncomplicated. The loneliness of a man who had forgotten that other people's company was a thing he was capable of wanting. The way station would sit at the junction of the two main trail systems that crossed the high country, a place where travelers moving between the territories could stop resupply, rest their animals, sleep in a warm space with a solid roof over their heads. Martha ran the books and managed the stores and cooked, not because cooking was a woman's job, which was a logic she had always found unpersuasive, but because she was better at it than Elias, whose approach to food was functional to the point of austerity, and who had once in her presence described a meal as adequate with the tone of a man offering high praise. Elias built and maintained and managed the stock and handled the trail work and the heavy physical demands of the property, not because they had decided he would, but because those were the things he was best at, and they were both at bottom practical people who organized their lives around what worked. The travelers came through in ones and twos and sometimes small groups, trappers and homesteaders and merchants, and the occasional marshal's deputy working a territorial circuit, and Martha fed them, and Elias directed them, and they rested their animals and moved on toward wherever they were going, carrying with them the knowledge that there was a warm place in the high country run by a large, quiet man and a competent woman who did not ask unnecessary questions and kept good coffee and charged fair prices and gave sound advice about the trail conditions ahead. On a September evening in the first full year of the way station's operation, Martha came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside Elias and looked out at the valley below and the mountains across it going purple and gold in the last of the light. The air had the first edge of autumn in it, not cold yet, but carrying the announcement of cold the way the mountain air does when the season is beginning to make its intentions known. Silas Calloway had been in the territorial prison at Helena since March, awaiting trial on charges that the federal prosecutor had described in a letter that Webb forwarded to them as the most comprehensively documented case of criminal conspiracy, weapons trafficking, and premeditated murder to come before the territorial court in 20 years of territorial jurisdiction. The letter noted that Thomas Voss's ledger had been formally entered into the federal record and that Thomas himself had been posthumously recognized as an official operative of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, his case file complete and his work acknowledged. Webb had written a personal note at the bottom of the letter in his careful hand, saying simply that justice in his experience tended to take longer than anyone wanted and arrive in ways nobody expected, and that this case seemed to him to be consistent with that observation. Martha had read that note 3 times and then folded the letter and put it in the box she kept on the shelf above the kitchen table, alongside the almanac, with its careful margins and the Pinkerton badge she still had not entirely decided what to do with. She sat beside Elias on the porch in the September evening and drank her coffee and looked at the mountains and felt the particular quality of stillness that comes to people who have survived a great deal and arrived somewhere they did not expect to arrive, and find it against all prior evidence genuinely good. Elias's rifle hung on its hook inside the cabin door. He had not taken it down since the morning they brought Silas off the mountain, not for hunting, not for anything, and Martha had not commented on this because it did not require comment. It was simply a thing he had put down and had not picked back up the way a person puts down the instrument of a life they have finished living. He reached over without looking at her and set his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, large and warm and unhurried, the hand of a man who is not going anywhere and knows it. She turned her hand over and held his. The mountains went from gold to rose to the deep blue of early dark, and the first stars came out above the ridge line with the clear, unhurried certainty of things that have always been there and intend to remain. And the 2 people on the porch of the way station sat in the gathering dark and held on to each other with the quiet, undemonstrative tenacity of survivors who have learned that this, The warmth of another person's hand in the mountain evening, the shared cup the next morning, already waiting with its ordinary requirements and its ordinary gifts, is not a small thing. It is in fact the whole thing. It always was.